Welcome to the channel, and thank you for joining us today. We have an incredible story lined up for you, and we can't wait to dive into it. Before we get started, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always great to hear from our global community. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss tomorrow's special story. We upload new, exciting content every day. And trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming next. So sit back, relax, and let's get started. What happens when a judge attacks a royal guard in court? Lieutenant Chris Williams walked with measured steps toward the Westminster Crown Court, his scarlet uniform gleaming in the morning sun. As he ascended the stone steps, passers-by slowed their pace, some even pausing to stare at the unexpected sight of a royal guard outside his usual post. His tall frame, standing at 6'2", made him impossible to miss, and his bear-skin cap added an extra foot to his height, making him tower over everyone in the crowd. The attention didn't faze him, though. After 8 years of serving in the Queen's Guard, he had become accustomed to it. A small child tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing excitedly at the uniform. Chris gave a slight nod, acknowledging the child's awe. It was moments like these that reminded him of the mystique that surrounded the regiment he served. The Queen's Guard wasn't just a military unit. It was a symbol of tradition, discipline, and service to the crown. And Chris was proud to represent that legacy. Today, however, was different. He wasn't standing at his usual post outside Buckingham Palace. He wasn't participating in a ceremonial march or guarding the gates of the palace. Today, he was a witness in a burglary case, called unexpectedly by the Crown Prosecutor's office. His statement had already been provided months ago, but the prosecutor needed him to appear today. It wasn't a complicated matter. Chris had simply been in the right place at the right time when the break-in occurred. Though his appearance in court was scheduled for next week, he had answered the call to duty, as any soldier would. The thought of stepping out of his usual duties didn't bother him. In fact, he was prepared to be back at Buckingham Palace shortly after providing his testimony. His uniform, as always, was immaculate. Scarlet tunic brushed to perfection, brass buttons polished to a mirror shine, and his white belt gleaming. Some might have thought it excessive for a brief court appearance, but for Chris, it was the only way to represent the regiment. His commitment to precision and professionalism was something that had been instilled in him over the years. As he made his way through the security checkpoint, a former military man nodded respectfully, recognizing the standard Chris upheld. With a slight smile, Chris passed through, ready to face the unexpected twists the day might bring. As Lieutenant Chris Williams entered the courtroom, he couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between his vibrant ceremonial uniform and the somber atmosphere of the legal proceedings. The heavy oak paneling of the courtroom seemed to absorb every sound, and the portraits of past judges hung on the walls, their stern expressions reminding everyone that this space was a place of authority and power. Chris, standing tall in the back row, knew the eyes of the room were on him, but he remained calm and composed, as he had been trained to do. The room grew quiet as Judge William Harrington made his entrance. A man with decades of experience, Harrington carried an air of superiority that was hard to miss. He walked in with the confident stride of someone used to commanding attention. As he took his seat on the bench, the room fell into silence. But then, the judge's gaze drifted toward Chris. The moment was brief, but noticeable. Chris remained still, his posture straight, his eyes focused ahead, but it didn't escape him that Harrington's attention had shifted. At first, it seemed like a mere curiosity, a passing glance at the ceremonial guard in the back of the room. But as the proceedings continued, it became clear that the judge was fixated on him. His questioning to the first witness seemed distracted, his sharp mind less focused than usual. Chris didn't move. He had witnessed this before. People's curiosity, their tendency to treat him like a symbol rather than a man. But this felt different. The judge's attention wasn't just a passing interest, it was becoming something more. Halfway through the second witness's testimony, Harrington suddenly slammed his gavel down, interrupting the case in mid-sentence. The prosecutor, clearly confused, stopped speaking. All eyes turned to the judge. Before we continue, Harrington's voice echoed across the room. I must address a matter of decorum. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "You there, in the costume, would you care to explain your choice of attire in my courtroom?" The insult hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Chris's hand rested lightly on his knee as he rose to his feet. His response was calm, measured, and respectful. "Lieutenant Chris Williams, Your Honor. Queen's Guard, 3rd Battalion. I'm here in an official capacity, scheduled to report to my post immediately after these proceedings." But the judge wasn't having it. "And you felt it appropriate to appear in full ceremonial dress rather than civilian attire?" Harrington's voice was sharp, almost mocking. "This is a court of law, Lieutenant, not a tourist attraction." The courtroom fell silent, the tension palpable. Chris's face betrayed nothing, his stance unwavering. He had been insulted, but he wouldn't rise to the bait. Instead, he simply said, "Regulations require that I appear in uniform when representing the regiment in an official capacity." The tension in the room was rising. This wasn't just about a uniform, it was becoming something much bigger. The tension in the courtroom grew thicker with every word that came from Judge Harrington's mouth. Chris Williams stood tall, his posture straight, his expression a mask of composure. He had been insulted, but he wasn't about to let this judge get the better of him. His response was calm, almost surgical in its precision. "Your Honor, I am on active duty, and the uniform I wear is part of my official responsibilities. I'm here today as a witness in this case, but I am scheduled to report to my post immediately after these proceedings." But the judge wasn't satisfied. Harrington's lips curled into a thin, mocking smile, clearly unimpressed by the explanation. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he continued. "So let me get this straight. You think it's appropriate to parade around in that theatrical uniform? We're in a courtroom, Lieutenant, not a museum. Your presence here is nothing but a distraction." His voice was sharp, dripping with contempt. Chris could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him. He knew the world outside the courtroom would have expected him to stay silent, to accept the insults without challenge. But that wasn't who he was. That wasn't who he had been trained to be. His 8 years in the Queen's Guard had taught him more than just standing still and marching in formation. It had taught him discipline, respect for authority, and above all, the value of maintaining your dignity even in the face of adversity. "I disagree, Your Honor," Chris replied, his voice unwavering. "The uniform I wear is part of my service to the Crown. It is a symbol of my commitment, my duty. If you believe it's a distraction, that speaks more to the mindset of the person who's distracted than the uniform itself." The room went quiet. The judge's face flushed with anger. He had been expecting Chris to back down, to shrink under the weight of his words. Instead, he was met with an even-keeled response that only fueled his irritation. "Tell me, Lieutenant," Harrington snapped, his voice rising, "is this just about following orders? Or is there something more to you? Do you even think for yourself, or are you simply a puppet, dancing to the whims of those above you?" The insult cut through the room like a blade. The prosecutor, who had been silent up to this point, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even the gallery seemed to hold its breath, unsure of where this confrontation was going. Chris's hands rested lightly on his knees, his face expressionless. He wasn't rattled. He was focused. This wasn't about him or his uniform anymore. It was about principle, about standing up for what was right, and he wasn't going to let this judge undermine that. "My training, Your Honor," Chris said evenly, "includes tactical and strategic education, as well as legal familiarization. I have a responsibility to think critically and independently, just like any other professional." The judge's face twisted into a sneer. "How quaint," he muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm sure your little speech is very impressive in your costume." But Chris didn't flinch. He knew what was coming next. And this time, he was ready. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Judge Harrington, his face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation, leaned forward, his eyes narrowed with contempt. The room was on edge, every person watching as the confrontation escalated. Chris stood perfectly still, his composure never wavering. He had expected insults, perhaps even some mockery, but not this blatant disregard for his service and character. Yet, he remained calm, his mind focused on the principles at stake. Harrington's sneer deepened as he grasped the gavel in his hand, clearly intent on ending this with a display of dominance. I've had enough of your back talk, Lieutenant. He spat, his voice rising. You think you can lecture me in my courtroom? Let me show you just who's in charge here. Without warning, the judge slammed his gavel down with such force that it rang through the room like a shot. The room fell into stunned silence as the heavy wooden gavel soared through the air, hurtling straight toward Chris. The motion was so swift, so unexpected, that for a split second it seemed impossible to react in time. But Chris, trained to respond with speed and precision, didn't hesitate. In one smooth, fluid motion, his hand shot up, catching the gavel midair with a practiced military grace. The entire courtroom froze. The room was silent, every person in the gallery wide-eyed, taking in the surreal moment. For a brief second, no one moved. The implications of what had just happened were too heavy to process. Chris stood there, holding the judge's gavel, his expression still impassive, as if this was just another day on duty. It was a surreal display of control, of power, that made the judge's actions look even more absurd in comparison. Harrington, for the first time since he entered the room, looked genuinely stunned. His hand, still raised as if to throw another strike, slowly fell to his side. His face drained of color, the reality of what he had done beginning to settle in. This was no longer about uniforms or decorum. This was about assaulting a witness, about a judge who had let his ego cloud his judgment and now had to face the consequences. Chris remained standing, the gavel now in his hand, his stance unbroken. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. "What you've just done constitutes assault on a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, a criminal offense under Section 39 of the Criminal Justice Act." His words rang clear and firm, his eyes meeting the judge's for the first time with a gaze that was both unwavering and authoritative. The room was now completely still, the reality of the situation dawning on everyone. Chris placed the gavel on the table, his movements deliberate and controlled, as if everything had unfolded according to plan. Additionally, this action constitutes judicial misconduct under Section 27 of the Courts Act, he continued, his voice rising slightly with the weight of the truth. Harrington's face turned a deeper shade of red. The situation was slipping out of his control, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Chris's composure, his calmness in the face of such outrageous provocation, was a testament to his training and discipline. And as he stood there in the face of authority that had tried to break him, Chris Williams knew that this moment, this stand, was about something much bigger than just one man's dignity. It was about justice. The courtroom, once tense and chaotic, fell into an eerie silence as Judge Harrington was escorted out, his face flushed with the weight of his actions. Chris stood still, his gaze unwavering, the gavel now sitting silently on the table before him. The moment had shifted completely. What had begun as a mere courtroom exchange had now become a matter of professional conduct, justice, and the integrity of those who upheld it. Chris didn't need to say another word. His stance alone spoke volumes. He had held his ground, exposed the judge's misconduct, and remained calm through it all. Security officers moved swiftly, their footsteps echoing in the now quiet room as they guided Harrington away. The Chief Magistrate, Judge Elizabeth Chamberlain, had arrived just in time to witness the unraveling of a once respected judge's career. As she surveyed the scene, her sharp eyes focused on Chris, who was still standing with perfect military precision. The respect he had commanded throughout the ordeal didn't go unnoticed, and as the room settled, a sense of justice began to take root. "Lieutenant Williams," Judge Chamberlain said, her voice firm but measured, "you've shown extraordinary restraint and professionalism in this matter. You've not only upheld the dignity of your uniform, but also stood firm for what is right. I apologize for the treatment you received today." Her words were not just an apology to Chris, but a public acknowledgement of the truth that had unfolded in the courtroom. The judge's misconduct had been exposed, and there was no turning back. Chris, ever composed, nodded in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Your Honor. I understand that today's actions do not represent the judiciary as a whole. My focus was always on the truth, and I only acted in accordance with what was just." As the tension slowly dissipated, Chris realized that the case, which had started as a simple burglary witness testimony, had now become a pivotal moment of accountability. His legal background, which he had quietly kept hidden from the courtroom, had been crucial in navigating the confrontation. His knowledge of both military and civilian law had allowed him to stand firm in the face of a judge who had lost his way. Later that day, as Chris took his post outside Buckingham Palace, the weight of the day's events still lingered, but his resolve remained unshaken. Tourists gathered around him, admiring the scarlet uniform, unaware of the storm that had just passed through the courthouse. But for those who had witnessed it, Chris Williams wasn't just a guard. He was a symbol of unwavering integrity and courage. His actions had not only defended his uniform, but had also sent a powerful message about standing up for justice, no matter the cost. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this incredible story. After everything Lieutenant Chris Williams faced, from the insults to the shocking moment when he caught the judge's gavel midair, what do you think? Was it fair for the judge to treat him that way? Or did Lieutenant Williams handle the situation with unmatched professionalism? Let us know in the comments. Your perspective matters to us. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up against authority like this? Maybe you faced a similar situation where staying calm and composed made all the difference. We'd love to hear about your experiences too. How do you think you would have reacted if you were in Chris's shoes? Do you think the judge's actions should have consequences beyond just this case? Share your thoughts and opinions with us, and let's have a meaningful discussion about the importance of integrity, respect, and standing up for what's right, no matter the odds. Don't forget to hit the like button if you found this story as powerful as we did, and make sure to subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. We post new content every day, and trust me, you'll want to be a part of the conversation. We can't wait to hear from you.